Hello. All right. So we have a few of you here. That's good. All right. So what we're doing is we're covering the first topic for the final test, and that is Andrew Jackson's alleged era. I say alleged because, I mean, naming an era after a president that adheres to great man history and great man history and historiography is a little bit passe. And yeah, and also in light of revisionist history that criticizes him. But it's kind of intellectual laziness naming that Jackson's era. But the textbooks still do, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll get into that today. All right. Anyone have anything to say of which I need to be aware? Any questions, comments? All right. All right. So I have the four of you. I'm going to share the screen. All right, I just put up the assignment 20 minutes ago. I apologize, so you may not have been able to see it yet. It's one large section, and here's kind of context to it. Okay, is when people cover Andrew Jackson's time period, they old school history, court history, would engage in Whig history. And remember, Whig history, the Whig Party, they believed and anticipated that believed in and anticipated the arrival of the opening of more opportunities, more power, more privileges, more participation by more demographics, right, in society in time. So that it hints, right, that there's kind of a linear direction in history, and it ought to and should go in a democratizing direction, right? Remember, demos means the people, the common people in Greek. So hence giving more and more power opportunities to the people. So you think of certain demographics, right? It's pretty easy to do Whig history when you do US history because it's very apparent, right? That according to laws of English subjectship, it went by blood. You had to have been the son of English parents, or at least a father, right? Or you had to have been born sometimes even both. You had to have been born in the English realms, right? Because coming in and trying to get your denizenship was tough, and it was kind of only a halfway uh, avenue toward integration, being allowed to be integrated into English society. So the rights of Englishmen, right? They were tough to meet. It was a tough criterion for someone to have the rights of subjectship. And then you look at the disenfranchisement of women, people that were non-English had the hardest time. I mean, even the Scots and Irish had to fight for it, and they were incorporated in 1707 under Great Britain. So how much more for like Belgians, Germans, Frenchmen, Italians, Spaniards, etc., right? And then, of course, when they came here from the very get-go, there was not a lot of active um, behavior and policy or institutions to integrate Native Americans. You had your praying towns of assimilated, converted Native Americans, but the rates of miscegenation are reportedly very low. You don't have any kind of colonial or even early republic state statutes or policies trying to integrate Native Americans, even if it were by forcing them to assimilate and become Christian and live like Anglo Americans, right? So the point is early in American history, a lot of demographics were clearly left out. And of course, needless to say, the slave codes, right? What we've gone over, the black codes for those who were not slaves, awful, awful stuff, right? So then you could try to find a linear pattern whereby one demographic after another finally becomes integrated, becomes joined to society and enjoying the same protections and liberties and rights as the others, right? So that's what they would do here is they said, well, I know by today's standards, after the civil rights movement and all, this seems like a baby step, but it was a step nevertheless, right? Whig historians might contend and say this was the era of the common man. Now they're stretching um, opportunities. I'm such a terrible speller. I think it's ostracized. I wrote that quickly. Um, but that you realize the integration of the poor common white man, and again by today's standards, big whip, right? In light of all the other demographics, but that even a small step is forward is constitutes a step forward, constitutes progress, arguably they say. And so that's what they like to focus upon. What they look to is they look to writers like contemporaries like Alexis de Tocqueville. Remember, he was very limited in how many places he traveled to. He was not here in the United States for very long. He initially was here from France to study the penal system, and so, you got to keep all that in mind. He didn't have access to census records, right? Bank records, uh, government records, et cetera, et cetera. So you got to keep that in mind because he pontificates a lot in his famous book. He wrote a book of his observations and his musings, and it's collectively was subsequently put together and published as Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. And it literally is considered an American classic. All right. And so in it, right, he kind of feeds that Whig interpretation. He states, first of all, right, that which was most salient to him, that stood out the most, was the fact that there was a general or relative equality of condition amongst Americans. Notice I didn't say just equality of opportunity, right? Everyone gets to start at the starting race. You're going to have clear winners and clear losers. And that's the name of the game, right? According to the founding fathers. And we talked about meritocracy with the Enlightenment and so forth. But here, right, it's a step further. He's saying, no, what strikes me is so many Americans are relatively located in the same economic condition. A lot of them own or rent a small plot of land. They're farming or producing something to be able to sell for profit at the local market, right? And they're constantly in search of buying bigger and better and moving up. So to him, right, he was enamored by this compared to France and in continental Europe. He felt like America, in many ways, was much more egalitarian than her contemporaries in the 1820s and 30s. And remember, egalitarian, everyone on relatively equal footing. So like I said, he mentions equality of condition, that you don't see like a large pauper class, homeless class, and then a dichotomy between that class. I'm sorry, guys, my throat. Uh, Between that class and like an aristocracy of some sort, right? That were in oligarchy fashion, buying and owning most of the land. And he didn't see that economically here in the United States. And he also saw a sense of expectancy, right? Richard Hofstadter, a historian in the 50s and 60s, he wrote about this, that Jackson's time period was about being an expectant capitalist, that people expected to rise up the socioeconomic ladder. They felt almost they were entitled to it. Common people that wouldn't have had, Alexis de Tocqueville contends, much of a chance of doing so in Europe, nor would they would have had much of a hope or expectation of doing so in Europe. So again, I don't want to step on anyone's toes, but I can recall like going through school and doing custodial work as a janitor, delivery work, jobs that society might have contended were quote menial jobs. They didn't pay real well. There wasn't a lot of prestige. There was a lot of work involved for not much recompense. There was not a lot of opportunities as far as rising up within that employer's establishment, right? But doing my school and getting my master's, there was expectation, right, that I'm not staying here. I'm going to move up. And likewise, that's what de Tocqueville observed in America, that he saw even the poorest, most humble Americans with almost, he said, a sense of haughtiness, almost a little bit of cockiness and expectation, like, hey, this isn't where I'm staying. Come see me in 5, 10 years, and I'm going to be living the good life. And of course, right, American institutions, advertisement had not yet come of age, but nevertheless, American political rhetoric, kind of fed that, right? So you can go along the lines of saying that this was kind of, propaganda, giving false hope to the people, right? That's a whole other can of worms. But whatever it was, Alexei de Tocqueville spotted it, that Americans had great expectations of doing well for themselves. He even half jokingly stated that he said an American will go and squat on land to the west, and before he's even finished his roof, this typical American will sell that property and sell that home, that cabin, and move to something in his eyes bigger and better, further west, etc. So that whole idea of commercialism, of consumerism, began taking hold of America. You have the beginning economic changes as far as modes of production. You had textile industry coming of age, so thus grew a great demand for cotton. So you had a lot of kind of parvenus, right? Like Beverly Hillbillies, people who went from rags to riches, nouveau riche, right? A lot of parvenus move into the deep South at the end of the War of 1812 into Mississippi, Alabama, and were able to grab lands taken from the Red Sticks by the end of the war, and were able to purchase a handful of slaves. Needless to say, credit became more available with the wildcat banks and the death of Hamilton's Central Bank under Andrew Jackson. So that credit and opportunity, because it takes money to make money, right? So would be capitalists, would be entrepreneurs or business owners needed a loan to get on their feet first, right? To pay for overhead before they could bring profit in. Infrastructure, remember, blew up in the 1820s, just after the War of 1812. So it connected markets. So thus, people realized there was growing a demand, especially with urbanization, to feed the people in the cities. And so cash cropping wheat or corn became popular, especially wheat, and selling it to these urban markets by way of the newly developed canals, and the toll roads, right? And the turnpikes, as they were called, right? And then by the 1840s, the beginning of railroads. And so these economic developments, right, are supposed to have been having a democratizing effect, an equalizing effect. So more people had an opportunity, had an incentive to try to achieve the American dream, right? Opening up of the West by way of the Louisiana Purchase, um, the War of 1812, right? And then later, of course, the Mexican American War and the loss of Texas in 1836 of Mexico. They're going to, that's going to open up lands for people to squat upon. So then not only were things democratizing economically, supposedly, right? And by the way, that's contested by some historians. Politically, right, the image is that things did democratize politically as well. So you see here, right, on this sheet, citizenship requirements virtually fell as far as the demand for property ownership. Remember, it was known as stake in society from English common law, the idea that if you don't have a stake, if you don't have something to lose in society, if you've not proven that you could become a landowner, then you can't be a trustworthy, responsible citizen. And so, at any rate, that dropped state after state. So now the propertyless renters and sharecroppers, right? Apprentices to mechanics in the cities. Now, these non property owning white men could now be citizens, right? Then you had log cabin culture. Um, so remember the three realms, right? That Max Weber and others have put society into, and history borrows from this: social, political, and economic. So we've talked about economic. We're talking now about politics, and the social realm is like culture, values, beliefs, right? And that there developed supposedly a political culture, right? That supposedly was somewhat antithetical to, kind of a 180-degree turn from the founding fathers generation of of um, of political values. That yes, the founding fathers, you have egalitarian rhetoric for sure, right? But remember, we talked about the conservatives, for instance, right, saying that everyone ought to be entitled, all white men, at least they said, right, ought to be entitled to the same political protections and opportunities, etc. But not all white men are equally capable of governing. And so you had that idea of the leisure class, right? Those who had the proper education, the leisure to read and study up on political science, etc., right? That they should be the ones that are trusted. They even used in the Federalist Papers the term filters, right? To filter out the poor ideas of their constituents and use as stewards or babysitters their own wisdom in making decisions as elected reps. And as we talked about, only one of the four major positions in the federal constitution is elected by citizens, only the House reps initially. So at any rate, now, however, right, they're tended to you could discern it in the campaign rhetoric and speeches, etc. Is now there seems to be a phenomenon whereby you try to convince your voters that you are not elitist in any way, but just the opposite, that you're one of them, that you were born in humble circumstances. You know what it's like to go hungry. You know what it's like to scratch and crawl your way up the socioeconomic ladder by hard work. No privileges or handouts had ever been given to you, that you earned every stripe of it, right? That you had become, in Henry Clay's words, a self made man. So you have people like Davy Crockett, Andrew Jackson, right? Henry Clay doesn't fit nearly as well, realistically. Neither it does Polk, the later president, but they still ran with that image, right? And it's called log cabin campaigns, this phenomenon, right? Or culture. And so, in particular, what's going to help people like Andrew Jackson is his very, national demographic, as he came from the Scots Irish. And the Scots Irish during the War for Independence, they'd had plenty of trouble and forced migration by way of the English government um, back in the British Isles. And then through misery and persecution, they left the British Isles, many of them in large numbers during the War for Independence. And you literally have evidence of some of the colonial governments, legislators, contending, Scots Irish, we don't want you. Please pass on through. So spokesmen like Daniel Boone and others encouraged them to leave, just keep traveling through the East Coast and make it up into the Cumberland Gap, right, of the Appalachian Mountains, and go into present day Kentucky and Tennessee in particular, right, and West Virginia. And so when they did that, right, they were already labeled as kind of misfits, as kind of, I hate to say it, but kind of a scum, uneducated, prone to rebellion and criminal activity, uh, libertarian to a fault, right? Big government, don't tread on me. So they put their trust in no type of government, but only in themselves and one another as their own demographic, right? And remember, you have the example of Kings Mountain, where both sides during the War for Independence tried to enlist their help through the Appalachian Gap, and they would not help either. So the British came in a punitive expedition with cavalry to punish them and force them to fight against the rebellion. And the Scots Irish won at Kings Mountain. And then they get a congratulatory letter from George Washington and the Continental Army saying, "We're proud of you. Now please come fight with us." And they said, "No, thank you." And Washington pretty much said, "I'll deal with you later." And so they had that kind of defiant, libertarian, low on the socioeconomic pyramid image, right? Or even stigma put on them. So now, in this topsy turvy political culture where it's considered cool, right? It's considered admirable to start from as humble origins as possible and earn your way up. They suddenly become, an extolled or praised demographic. And so, Andrew Jackson, his background fit perfectly into that. His parents were Scots Irish. His dad died, they think, connected to a logging accident while his mom was still pregnant with him. His brothers, and I believe it was two of his brothers and his mother, died during the War for Independence. And so he was orphaned by the time he was 14, sent out to like a great uncle, and who was supposedly abusive, and he ran away from. And so, I mean, he had a very tough, uh, you know, uh, upbringing, right? And so, and then of course, you get the famous stories of him starting his own patrol of young kid fighters, right, and spies during the War for Independence, in which they're captured by Brits, and they were told to reveal where some militiamen were hiding, and he adamantly refused, and they threatened to kill him. On another famous anecdotal occasion, which we'll never know the veracity of it, a grown man told him to clean his boots, and he refused. Right, this kind of proud, defiant, poor, independent kid, right, rugged frontiersman. This young teenage kid says no, and so the guy supposedly may have killed him with a scabbard with a blow, but another Brit put his arm in front and to mitigate the blow, and it left a lifelong scar across his eyebrow on his face. And then later on, right, his infamous duels. Oh my goodness, I can recall at least four or five occasions in which he got in duels. One with a Dickinson gentleman in which he actually killed him. Crazy, crazy stuff, right? And but at this time period, that's supposedly seen as evidence of his frontier DNA, right? That he's a man of the people, etc. And so, believe it or not, that didn't greatly adversely affect his political reputation, knowing that fiery, frontier-like temperament that he had. And so, when he becomes president, right, he's going to utilize a term very often, and it's called mandate of the people or mandate from the people, right? Like the Spanish mandato is a demand, a command, right? Where he states that when certain indices, right, like index, plural, certain indices seem to indicate the will of the people on a given issue, whether it be politicians running for office, they make it clear what they stand for, and then those politicians are overwhelmingly elected. Then by inference, right, the people knew exactly who and what they were voting for, and they clearly have given a mandate that that's what they want done, what that politician said would be done, right? And because you didn't have initiative yet, right, where you get signatures together and people go and make a demand of the state legislator that they tackle a certain issue. We're nowhere near that yet, but like I said, there were certain indices that he contended made it clear what the people wanted, and to him, right, it was that very term. It was a mandate. You couldn't question it. What the people wanted ought to be put into practice, right? And he's going to utilize that in killing the bank. He's going to utilize that in the Trail of Tears episode that you're going to read about in this argumentative assignment, okay? And contend that, hey, it's what the will of the people want. And you have to remember, right, the founding fathers, they implemented a lot from like Montesquieu, the Baron de Montesquieu's writings, and he wanted a republic for a reason, right? A system of checks and balances. You look back at your ancient, Greco especially, criticisms of democracy, and they contend, we went over this during the Confederation assignment, that the average person is going to be led by pathos, by emotion. The average person is not educated enough. The average person does not have the leisure to educate him or herself on political issues, right? And so for those reasons, and then also you even get into the elitism of the Greeks of the term appetites, the terms appetite and reason, that the average person lacks self-control, and that only the numerical minority of people in a given society are virtuous enough and with self-control, right, to empower them to make wise decisions as politicians. So for all those reasons and more, right, and remember also the fact that the stereotype that like with the Gracchus brothers of Rome, that the common people are going to envy and covet the wealth and the land of the rich, and they're going to make foolish, rash decisions, right, that emanate from that envy, and it's going to help uh, you know, uh, create economic dislocating crises like recessions and depressions, or even worse, cause a civil war between the rich and the poor, class warfare. So, at any rate, at this time period, he acts as if that is just an axiom, an assumption you don't question, is you follow the will of the people. Well, that was somewhat novel for someone to be that blatant about that stand, because, like I said, American and especially English political tradition was not high on the preponderance, much less the sole rule of democracy, right? but that's his popular term, right? Is that the people want it. So hence, as their elected rep, there's a virtual demand, a command from them for him to do as they wish. All right. So in that, right, you have you have the question, who's really manipulating whom, right? Because the politicians, some of them are feigning to be one of the people when they really were born into wealth, right? Like James Polk, William Henry Harrison. Uh, some of them, right, are very ambiguous with their platform. They don't even have much of a clear ideology or platform because they're so afraid of making a wrong decision, an unpopular decision that's going to alienate certain demographics, right? So they deliberately stay vague and they just try to gauge, right? Like go like that, testing the wind, and they try to gauge what is popular, what is the will of the majority of my voters, and whatever it is, I'm going to cater to it, right? And so you had pageantry, you had parades. If you look at the back of Alan Brinkley's textbook, it's amazing how many, the percentage of eligible voters that actually went to the polls and voted for the president. I mean, no kidding. It virtually doubled from like 40 something percent going into the 1820s to up into the 70s and even 80% of eligible voters voting. That's incredible, right? As far as political participation. But then again, right, during their rallies, they were scripted. They accepted only certain questions beforehand, had prepared notes to respond to which, right? I think of a contrast, right? In modern day context, I think of like France, the people running, right, for their kind of prime minister position, right, their premier position. They are allowed no notes, no knowledge prior to to becoming grilled, so to speak. They get up there, and for 3 hours, they are to have anything that the facilitator so decides to be thrown at them, and they are to have debate with one another. So this really forces them, right, to formulate a set, coherent platform, an ideology, to make it clear what they believe in, what principles they stand by, right, and try to consistently do such and profess such for their can for their their constituents to see. And you don't see that by that standard, by that comparison. This time period very superficial, right? With fireworks and wild animals on leashes and lots of hoopla, but not a lot of depth as far as a clear ideology. Did someone have a comment? Don't forget, if you do, by all means, chime in, okay? So, at any rate, the majority of these poor white Americans, right, they had this kind of sense of distrust, right? Of They had a distrust of the establishment, if you will, right? Kind of using a term from like the New Left later on in the 1960s and 70s, right? Kind of encapsulating big business and government, right? The rulers, the elite, right? There was a very anti-establishment sentiment during this time period that seems to have prevailed, right? And so people like Andrew Jackson, they came in popularly as an anti-model, right? Of saying, hey, I'm an outsider. I'm not part of the establishment. I'm not part of the in club, the privileged club, right? I'm one of you. So I'm bringing you with me into the White House. So, like I said, citizenship requirements were dropped in virtually every state. The nomination process went from the upper house legislators in each state forming caucuses, as they were called, these self appointed groups that would decide who was going to run for office, to the party convention system, where the parties would declare and publicize via newspapers, right, that they were having a convention somewhere. And technically, any citizen could nominate any other citizen for office, right? So that greatly kind of democratized the nomination process of being able to run for office. Um, so those were changed. They even tried to do away with the electoral system, which of course we still have. So obviously they failed. but that was not even off the radar for the Democratic Party and Andrew Jackson, right? So you have those types of democratic changes that are going on. Also, equality of economic opportunity, the Charles River Bridge case. You had a group of parvenus, a poor, uneducated white man trying to build a rival bridge along the Charlestown River with some Ivy League guys who had previously established a bridge and were charging toll prices from it. So, hence, they were threatening, right, to take their business. So, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they contended that it was suggested in the state's patent that they alone could have the ability to build a bridge in that area of the Charles River. And I apologize. I wish I were more knowledgeable in political science, because to this day, right, you could have a given city, right, decides on one given company, for instance, for its water, for its utilities, electricity, etc., right, for its public parks, a single construction company, perhaps. So there are, areas, there's wiggle room for which a single company can extract a monopoly like contract from a city or a local government. But in this case, right, it didn't fly. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And under Taney and others, they're going to make it clear that this is a land of opportunity, and that if a group of parvenu hillbillies want to build a bridge right next to an Ivy League bridge, they're entitled to do so, right? So that was supposedly very symbolic of this victory of Jackson's culture and Jackson's time period. And then the bank, right? Nicholas Biddle. There's evidence, right, that remember Hamilton. It was kind of the later 1950s paradigm. What's good for General Motors is good for America, right? That we need to have diversification and infrastructure, and we can't go to mom and pop businesses to do this, right? To build a railroad across 4 states, for instance, right? Or to manufacture boots and shoes, etc., in mass production fashion. So instead, they go to the bigger businesses and they grant them, government bond issues and other things in quid pro quo fashion to try to help them, because supposedly what they're doing in their business is good for America in general. But what does it look like, right? De facto, it looks like a plutocracy, like the government is in cahoots with the wealthy, with big business, right? And so there was a kind of a populist anger toward that elite faction of big businesses and the federal government and federal bank in particular. So it was a popular decision again for Andrew Jackson to say, no, I'm ending the charter to the National Bank. And better yet, I'm going to encourage the allocation of federal funds in it to local state wildcat banks that are going to lend to the common people in the states that are trying to buy land and become cash crop farmers themselves, etc. So it was a very politically shrewd decision, right? But it also arguably was connected to the subsequent recession that we experienced in 1836. And so let's see here, or 1839 was it? At any rate, let's see, where am I going here? So that's kind of the court history, okay? So then conflict history. A guy named Richard Hofstadter in the 50s and 60s says, well, yes, Andrew Jackson was a parvenu and he was for other parvenus, but that's it. That he had an elitist concern only for gentlemen like himself, uh, only the cream of the crop amongst the poor white men in the country, and he expected them to rise up as he had. But as far as the notion of truly being egalitarian, truly being for all the common white folk, at least, right? That he had an elitism, a snobbishness about him. There's evidence that he showed a bit of disdain when a mob of people came and rushed into the White House when he was inaugurated, when he had just won the presidency, that he didn't want to be in the company of these dirty faced, barefoot people that were spilling and stealing things from the White House and breaking windows. So much so that ex-president John Quincy Adams' wife stated, "Good God, the mob has entered the White House." But to Hofstadter, he didn't really represent that. When he made his way up, he apprenticed himself to an attorney, And in many cases, right, he supported land speculators kicking squatters off their lands. So, hence, representing the wealthy guys over the poor squatters trying to gain access to a parcel of land. So that, hence, he was a typical guy that was out for himself, and that at the very most, he was wanting to open opportunities for men that he esteemed to be like himself, cream of the crop, most talented, what they might call a natural aristocracy, right? So something to think about. And then he ruled in kind of unilateral way, right? Um, he advocated states' rights when it came to the Trail of Tears, which we'll get to soon. But then when the nullification crisis happened and the abominable tariff, right? A tariff, right, had been enacted upon the textile products coming from Flanders and England and from abroad, right? And so thereby putting an artificially high price on clothing for us to buy, or more likely forcing us to buy lower grade quality um, American products, right? American clothing. And so this greatly helped our textile manufacturers. So then the lobbyist for the South said, what about cotton? Then we want protection on cotton. Cotton coming in from Egypt, from India. We want a big import tax on that, right? And of course, preponderance of Northerners in Congress said no. And so when you look at a given clause in the Constitution, it states that no particular port or industry, right, ought to be privileged over another when it comes to import taxes and export taxes, etc. That basically there's to be no favoritism and there's to be uniformity. So based upon that, right, some of the southern states like South Carolina contended that this tariff was unconstitutional, and in that it favored the northeastern clothing textile manufacturers at the expense of the cotton producers. And Andrew Jackson threatened to invade within his own navy, invade South Carolina, right? And so clearly now he's become no longer just a typical Democrat, libertarian, states' rights guy, right? Now he's about federal authority. But then in the Trail of Tears, he said, hey, that's what Georgia, that's what North Carolina wants. So let's abide by it. So he was inconsistent that way, right? And so at any rate, let's see here. The bank war, he did not want much help and latitude given to Congress. He wanted to unilaterally, as the executive, kill the license of the Bank of the United States, and he wanted it to end there. So he used kind of unilateral sway, or tried to at least, during the bank wars against Nicholas Biddle. The Seminole Wars, this is before he was president, but he arguably defied federal orders going into Spanish Florida, hanging a couple British agents, so he said were fomenting rebellion, supposedly used evidence of the Spanish governor arming and encouraging rebellion amongst the Seminole and other tribes in Spanish Florida to cross the Spanish Florida border and fight and kill Americans. And he used that as an excuse to take over, Pensacola and areas of Florida, and pushed for Florida to be taken from Spain. So he really threw his weight around in the military and caused a lot of alarm amongst his superiors, like Madison and Monroe. And then, the Worcester decision was a Supreme Court decision, right, that defended the Cherokee in particular and the other civilized tribes, contending that a federal treaty trumps a state eminent domain law. That when the state told the Native American tribes, right, like in Georgia, for the betterment of the state, for the general welfare, you must sell your properties to us, right? And we'll purchase them from you, and you are to relocate out of our state. But before that, right, you have like the Treaty of Ashota and these other treaties that had given that land sovereignly, separately to the Native Americans. Now, it also what had cemented this, politically on paper, was the McIntosh case, right? MCINTOSH. The McIntosh case contended that the Native American tribes are separate from state sovereignty and that they are a dependent ward of the federal government in a special category, right? And so, based upon those, the Supreme Court said, federal authority trumps state authority. So, if a federal authority stated that that land is given and recognized for these quote civilized tribes, then no mere state eminent domain law trying to force them to sell their land can supersede that. That the federal treaties and Supreme Court decisions supersede that. And what does Jackson do? He defies that Supreme Court decision. And remember, that was a concern of Alexis de Tocqueville. He wasn't always bragging when he wrote about Americans. He's because to him, right, he thought America was a little bit too democratic, right? Whereby the majority was kind of, and their politicians were kind of pandering to the lowest common denominator, okay? The lowest common denominator. And I generically connect that to the term populism. This can mean so many different things, okay? But to me, I think it's related. That's how I partially, define and identify that term. Is to me, populism involves just that. Is that you appeal to the lowest common denominator. You see what the people want in a very amoral way. You don't think about what's ethically right or wrong, right? That you're just inclined to take advantage and try to, capitalize upon their negative attributes, their negative sentiments, as you are their positive ones. So, for instance, right, if you believe the people of a generation are xenophobic, right, fearfully hateful toward outsiders of all types, then as a populist leader, you run with that and say, yeah, and you say ill things of Native Americans, ill things of bourgeois urbanites in New York, right, and intellectuals and other members of the intelligentsia or banking elite that were distrusted in a populist environment, right? You capitalize on that, and you feed their negative emotions, their negative perceptions of those demographics. So now you could be creating a monster, right? I've heard it said that one person sarcastically stated that democracy is like two wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner. So obviously you get that joke, right? The two wolves are going to outvote the lamb and vote to eat that lamb. And so hence the term tyranny of the majority, that sometimes, right, 50% plus one can become just as tyrannical over the 49% as one single person or one oligarchic group could be, right? And so you see that with people, xenophobic or xenophobia, uh, anti-dissent, right? Where you have an environment that whereby you do not tolerate dissent of any sort. If anyone comes with a different perspective, a different worldview from a different demographic, wants to see things differently, there's no intellectual free market of ideas whereby people can freely have dialogue, discourse, debate, right? But there's just no tolerance for that group, right? For that type. So that's something that can be scary in its consequences, right? So hence the majority were either indifferent about, afraid to confront, or absolutely racistly okay with slavery. So hence it was very dangerously unpopular to take a stand against slavery in the 1820s and 30s. Native Americans, right? Again, displaced. And the irony is, right, here is the irony over assimilation. You had certain tribes, namely the Cherokee and the Choctaw, whereby you have plenty of evidence of them showing great signs of assimilating, of dropping their Native American culture and becoming more Anglo-American. This is just one of several books. John L., The Trail of Tears, The Rise and Fall of the Cherokee Nation. It's a pretty good book. It's pretty informative. It's kind of anecdotal. It does in the form of lives of key individuals that were instrumental in it. But it's a sad, sad story, right? Um, you have, for instance, right, a particular Cherokee chief who says, okay, fine, you know what, for the betterment of our people and to prove to the white man, to the paleface, that we are worthy of inhabiting this land, we're going to go ahead and open our arms to white missionary schools and sending our kids to them, right, to become educated. And what do you know? His own son um, became a Christian and was sent to a well to do American college in the Northeast, right? So the son is sent up there. Then the son has drama because he and an Anglo woman fall in love with each other, and both parents are against it. And it eventually happened. Um, but just showing that the all the forces at work, right? Like I said, it reads like a good novel. And then you had a dichotomy oftentimes between the old and the young. Now, oftentimes, right, it seems like in sociology and psychology, youth, kind of like you can't treat an old dog new tricks, that oftentimes youth historically have been the demographic that's more progressive, more forward looking, wanting to embrace new things, right? They're not set in their ways yet, etc. But there's an irony in the primary sources of just the opposite here amongst the Native Americans, that it was many of the elder leaders, right, of these civilized tribes that were more open to assimilating institutions like white schools, um, churches, right, farming and cash crop farming and subsistence farming, right, getting integrated into the local markets, etc. And the youth, however, when you look at the young warriors, they tended to split, and literally some of them had factional disputes, and there were even murders on both sides, where this is going to split them. And ironically, you find a lot of the youthful leaders who were too proud to accept this. They don't want to sell out their ways in their own minds, and they want to stay indigenous, Native American in their culture, in their ways, etc. Right? So sadly, for instance, when the Cherokee leaders give in and sell their lands to Georgia and move to Oklahoma, right, in the infamous Trail of Tears, um, that young man, the young son of the chief, who very hesitantly signed his name to the transfer and to the move. Um, he didn't even make it. I'm not even sure if he made it to Oklahoma. He was murdered by young warriors of his own Cherokee tribe for, quote, selling out his people and touching the white man's pen. And so it's very, very fascinating, very, very tragic and sad story, the Trail of Tears. And so I give more detail on it in your argumentative assignment. So please read through it carefully, and I'm sure you'll do very well. All right. Um, and then another notion to this that I want to put on here is, King Andrew is, and so by the way, right, what does King Andrew do? I'm saying that euphemism. What does President Andrew Jackson do? Is when the Worcester decision happened, he basically stated that he's going to override it because there was a popular mandate from the people of the Carolinas and Georgia, etc., that they wanted those lands and the Native Americans out. Then he used the argument that the Native Americans are unassimilable, right? That they are unwilling and or unable, even if they want to fully assimilate, right? To embrace the white man's culture and ever to be truly integrated into white society. That basically Native Americans and Anglo Americans are like oil and water. They could never mix, even if you wanted them to. And then kind of in slippery slope argument logic fashion, he says because they are incompatible, it is inevitable that sooner or later conflict will ensue, right? Since they cannot integrate, it is supposedly unavoidable that they're going to eventually fight. And when they do, he said, it's inevitable just by numbers and technology alone that the Anglo Americans are going to win and wipe out the Native Americans. So therefore, he alludes to the McIntosh case and stating that the Native American tribes are a specially protected ward of the state, like orphan children, prison inmates, people in quote insane asylums, right? That they're in a special category whereby the federal government is like their paternal father figure. He says, therefore, according to the McIntosh case, I am going to rescue the Native Americans from their own eventual doom, that it is for their own good that I force them to remove themselves to a safer place in the West, into Oklahoma and Arkansas. Interesting, huh? So he sends in his armed forces and forces them to relocate. And by the way, there were several trails of tears, but there was just one infamous one from Georgia that got a lot of publicity because one supposedly warrior that his peers had never seen cried on in embarking on that trip, and just a sad, sad story. And then you look at the repercussions, and I have some of them in the handout of defeatism, turning to alcohol, dying of disease, malnourishment, unsanitary conditions once they got there, parasitical white merchants moving right into their areas like Fort Smith and these other areas where they were sent to try to take advantage of them economically. It is just a sad, sad story. But with this, right, as some people would contend and argue that Jackson was a demagogue. Remember, a demagogue, man, I'm such a terrible speller. A demagogue is someone who claims to be one of the demos, one of the commoners, right? But he manipulates their emotional buttons in particular, right? He manipulates their pathos, right? In particular, their emotions, right? And their logos and their thinking, and tells them what they want to hear, right? But is really only out for his own aggrandizement, his own growth of power, etc. So, boy, right? To me, Andrew Jackson epitomizes uh, the um, the complexity of history, where the old Whig history accounts, he's a hero, he's a symbol of the common man, finally getting his chance at running things in this country and being fully integrated. And then the civil rights movement happens in the 1960s, and historians are like, what about all the other demographics? What about the way this president pulled his weight? What about the phenomenon of the tyranny of the majority against the numerical minority? All right, so any comments or questions? You guys still with me? You guys are quiet. All right. Well, you guys, if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Remember, I just put this on about 20 minutes prior to to the um, the Zoom meeting, so you should be able to find it. Okay.
I have a question, but it's not regarding this assignment. It's regarding the quiz.
Sure.
Is there a due date on there? Because when I go on to quiz, it says no due date.
Okay. You know what? I will rectify that. Okay. I'm telling you right now. I don't know if it was your class, maybe I failed to do it for your class, but because I have not been up to date on the quizzes, I'm going to shortly put all of them up, and I'm just going to have them not do virtually any of them until the end of the school year. Because I'm very
Okay.
adamant about that. That anything that I do, um, you know, as any mistake that I make, right? Any way in which I fall behind on my duties will never constitute your emergency. You'll never be punished for it. So therefore, like I said, because of that, I feel I owe that to you, putting the quizzes up late to maximize the amount of time you have to do them. So yeah, I will put them up. I'll have them posted, and I will also make it clear what the due date is, and the due date is going to be pretty much the end of the semester. to give you plenty of time to do the rest of them.
Sounds good. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, anyone else? Do you guys feel like you have a decent command over this topic? Okay, I got a thumbs up. Thank you, Ali. All right, you guys. So that's it. That's it for today, okay? And you guys, good luck on it. You have until the night of the 23rd. So jump on it, okay? And then we just have a few more after this and one more test and we're done. So hang in there, okay? And have a good day.